Things are going to start happening to me now.
You've done all the reading. You're a scholar. You're a professor. You've done all the reading. You've done the intellectual heavy lifting.
More or less, eat shit and die.
You wouldn't know a fact if it begged you all night long.
Want to give the wrong impression, because I am very high.
Ran up behind him with a hatchet. Smash, smash, smash.
Yeah. Care. I'm a libertarian. What I'm getting is,
Did you vote for Joe Jorgensen or Trump?
Who?
Joe Jorgensen.
That was the perfect answer. Thank you.
And welcome everybody to the Libertarian Podcast Review. We're on the warpath, and we're on another one today. We're going to take on once again Nick Gillespie and the Reason Podcast, Tyler Yonke, Garbage Man Andy, and
what up?
And yes, welcome. And today we're joined by the great Tho Bishop. I just wanted to first of all say, Tho, and you could give your bona fides here real quick, but you do have the distinction of being one of the people to be on Rush Limbaugh's almost very last show. I think it was January 2021. He read an article that you did for Mises Institute and passed away like maybe 2 weeks after that. And shortly, it was his last episode. Tho Bishop of the Mises Institute, welcome. And what do you have to say about your being on the Rush Limbaugh show?
Yeah, no, that was, I never had so many messages pop up at the same time. I was getting flooded from every single platform I had online at that point. It was really a surreal experience.
So he didn't give you a heads up? You just
No, I had no idea at all.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it was an article I wrote that I was far harsher on Trump than some of the other content I've written in the past. And so for him to pick up that of all of them, that was a very strong Rothbardian sort of take. And I think it has a great it supported some of my views on kind of some of the shift on the right a great deal. That was something that resonated with him, but no connection with him passing away a couple weeks later.
No, I didn't say it was your fault.
Yeah, but I grew up very much enjoying the entertainment of Rush Limbaugh, as a sick and twisted, politically inclined teenager. So it was a great honor.
Yeah, same here. So that was it was kind of fitting. On that real quick, because your whole premise there was Trump is going to make people, and this is right after, by the way, Biden's been elected or inaugurated. So it was going to force people to, millions of people now, I think you said like 50 million plus, are going to actually be hating the state. Has that come true for you?
I think so. I think you still see the rabid nature, the way that people view the attacks on Trump by the FBI, by these other institutions. I think the distrust of the regime is still very much there. The number I pulled for was that at the time I think it was polling 2/3 of the electorate of Trump's base thought the election was illegitimate, and I think that's largely still the case. And I think it does twist the way that people view the federal government as a whole. Whether that's enough to build a governing coalition going forward. I mean, the midterms did not quite turn out the way that I expected them to do. But I think that hostility is still there, and I think that the reason why you see someone like a DeSantis be so successful is effectively trying to offering an alternative. It was standing up effectively against both the state and the private actors serving as the enforcement arm of the state, and that's really, I think, one of the more interesting dynamics on the right is normalizing that sort of real firepower, rather than just simply tweeting about it and complaining.
Gotcha. So and well done. Once again, congratulations. Andy's been on InfoWars, not as a guest, but as a caller. Okay.
That was after the Uvalde shooting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You weren't denying that they were actors or anything like that, was that?
No, I said we need private security in schools, and you should give them tax breaks for doing it.
All right. Well, there you go. Tho, just give your bona fides real quick. Who are you? I know you're with the Mises Institute. I'm going to tag a bunch of stuff for everyone to check out online, including the article that Rush referenced and actually his last script in there, so people can check that out. And you are part of the Radio Rothbard podcast with Mises. That is kind of one of the big reasons why you're in here. We needed a Rothbard expert.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So Radio Rothbard, I co-host it with Ryan McMakin, who's the chief editor for the site. I'm communications director for the Mises Institute. And I've had several articles republished by InfoWars. So
Okay.
I'm a proud InfoWars veteran on that side as well. A great appreciator of the folk libertarianism of Alex Jones. Prior to being with the Mises Institute, actually was up in D.C. for about 3 years with the House Financial Services Committee. I was deputy communications director up there, which was fun because I got to be sort of a mole for Ron Paul within a non-Ron Paul office. So that was always fun, getting drinks afterwards with colleagues and having them try to quiz me on the gold standard and all sorts of really fun libertarian nerdish stuff like that. And so, yeah, I've got the best job in the world working for the Mises Institute now, and hoping to keep that gig going for as long as I can.
Yeah, well, I hope today's appearance doesn't ruin anything for you on there, but I think Andy and I will keep it clean and it should be good. Okay, so one of the big things on this, we were just kind of talking before we came live here that I think personally that I know there's a lot of hate. And matter of fact, I think there were some people saying, don't even watch this episode, this interview. It's just clickbait type of thing. I think Clint Russell said that. And I totally disagree. One, I do like Nick. You can have different points of view. As far as the scope of U.S. goes, he's more on our side than not. At least I believe so. And though, yeah, you've got a little different aspect you've been taking, at least in the last several years. But I think these interviews serve a purpose. And some of that is to shine light onto some of these people. We saw it with Penn Jillette going way off the rails. Michael Shermer kind of saying some of the same things. And so whether you think that, and I think Nick pulls some things at it, what do you think about, should you even be watching these interviews?
Oh, no, I really enjoy Reason's content, particularly the long form interview stuff. I mean, I like Matt Welch's The Fifth Column podcast.
Yeah.
That's with Camille Foster and the Vice guy. Often I find myself, in complete disgust right at some of the viewpoints there, right? I mean, I hate, I hate this idea of like libertarian, circle jerks. Everything sounds the same. Like I don't want to listen to, like I don't consume a lot of libertarian podcast content because there's very few libertarian shows out there that provide me something unique. And Reason's perspective, I think, does provide it. And I mean, Nick Gillespie, I think this is his interview with Dave Smith. He defined like his view of libertarianism, and again, it's something I want nothing to be a part of, to be perfectly honest. But it was very refreshing to hear it be very clearly defined. It's talked about like his view of libertarianism really is not about hating the state or property rights or anything like that, but the promotion of alternative lifestyles. It's part of that this broader sort of individual liberation sort of ideology. Right, that we should have the freedom to completely sort of recreate the human experience and things like that. And you do see this, I think, motivate a lot of different types of libertarian out there. That's fine. I wish no ill of any of them. It just makes it very clear that that's not my motivation for libertarianism. I see libertarianism as very kind of a thin political philosophy. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've been sold is the idea that, golly gosh darn, all libertarians should be joining together in some sort of great libertarian movement, and that's going to create human freedom in our time. I think that's entirely inadequate. I think libertarianism, again, as a political philosophy, is a very thin view of the way that we think the world should be, and so recognizing broader cultural agreement and trying to ally with those that share the real existence that we want for ourselves and our family. I don't want to be Nick Gillespie's neighbor, and that's fine. He probably wouldn't want to be mine either. And it's fine. I think there's strength in recognizing those differences than trying to shoehorn together some sort of liberty movement.
Okay, Andy, is that your take as well?
Nick Gillespie would be an upgrade from my current neighbors right now. But if I had a choice, I would pick neither.
Well, yeah. So we have that issue. Okay, let's just jump into it. Let's pull this right up. I've got, and by the way, if there's a spot you want me to stop or pause at, that's fine. I'm not going to run this straight through. I've just taken a bunch of different sections where I think there's good stuff, and to some extent, almost not remove Nick's commentary, but just kind of get the okay. So here's the lowdown on Andrew Koppelman. Did you know much about him before this, though?
I did not. I knew that book was coming out. And there was a David Gordon review of it, and I know David Gordon, said some nice things about it was not a hit piece, right? He had some disagreements, but that Koppelman does tries to be as honest and objective as he can. So I respect that, and I think it comes across in the interview, even those points of obviously very sincere disagreement.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just start out and see what they have to say.
The libertarian movement has lost its way over the past 60 years as it shifted from Friedrich Hayek's classical liberal corrective to Depression-era central planning to Murray Rothbard's full-blown anarcho-capitalism in which all taxation is theft and all transfer payments are immoral. That's the argument in a provocative new book called Burning Down the House: How Libertarian Philosophy Was Corrupted by Delusion and Greed, by Andrew Koppelman. Reason spoke with Koppelman, a law professor at Northwestern University, about why he believes classical liberals have given ground to anarchists and how that fundamentally changes not just the rhetoric, but the political goals of the libertarian movement. Andrew Koppelman, thanks for talking.
I'm very happy to be here.
All right. So here, give me this. You're a law professor at Northwestern University, right? You've taught various places and things like that. Let's start. What's the elevator pitch of Burning Down the House?
The elevator pitch is that American libertarianism has a valid core. The valid core is understanding the value of free markets, which is something that is not well understood by everyone on the left. But libertarianism has increasingly taken the form of an extreme anti-statism, which its proponents believe will actually advance human liberty if we cripple the capacities of the American state. It's not going to do that. And a large part of what the state does is it protects us from predators and from forces that aren't anybody's fault, but that you need the state to control, such as COVID. It's a good example. Mm-hmm. So the interest in crippling state capacity has ended up being a coalition of two different groups of folks. There are the folks who believe in bad political philosophy. That's really the audience for my book. It's people who are attracted to this philosophy and who I want to persuade.
To bad political philosophy.
Bad political philosophy.
Okay.
Political philosophy that is poorly reasoned and that will not lead to the attractive results that it advertises, will not lead to an advance in human freedom. And in politics, the desire to cripple state capacity attracts a coalition of idealists who believe in that stuff and unscrupulous businessmen. Most businessmen are very scrupulous, but the unscrupulous ones are drawn to this because it enables them to hurt people without being bothered by the police.
Okay, Tho, what's your first, you hear the elevator pitch, anything in there you disagree with or that you'd like to start off with, considering that you're Radio Rothbard, you probably have bad politics.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I find kind of refreshing about it is that it's kind of getting back to some good old classic libertarian infighting, right? Which is kind of this broader sort of dynamic between Rothbardians and Hayekians. And he's starting off with the viewpoint of, Hayek's a serious guy and Rothbard's kind of the crank, and he gets into some of his criticisms of Rothbard later. But I think it's fascinating that, right from the get-go, the way that he views the state, right, is, it protects us from predators, and it's important for dealing with the big things like COVID. And I think this goes kind of, I think underpins, and I think these are some legitimate criticisms of Hayek as well, that are legitimate. That there goes into, there's ultimate assumptions within this that are guiding to how they're judging these different political viewpoints. I do think that there is a valid point, though, that classical liberalism is distinct from Rothbardian anarchism. And I think, again, this goes back to the point I was making earlier about libertarianism, is that we use this label kind of to gloss over these two distinct differences. And I think those differences do matter. And so this is what he's trying to do is peel apart the one and highlight one as good and more useful, particularly from what is a kind of a market leftist lens, I think is the one, that's something he'd be comfortable with, versus, this anti-state anti-state capacity, anarchism of Rothbard. And I think that does touch into, Buchananite populism, right, against the regime. And it works even today with, like the Niskanen Center, and Tyler Cowen with Mercatus had a big, very, very serious, important article about state capacity a while back. So this does touch on very relevant, I think, and valid schisms here.
Let me just ask you, as someone who's not as steeped in all this as you are, is classical liberalism, or libertarianism for that matter, is it really coming out of Hayek, or because they don't mention Mises at all? So and it seems like to me that Hayek was a little bit of a deviation from Mises himself. And so what's the context there? They're just taking it from, hey, Hayek is the way forward, and we've all gone and mutated, as they say, from there.
Yeah. So Mises definitely was a very significant intellectual force within the early libertarian movement, its impact on Fee, and some of the Leonard Reed and some of the institutions that Henry Hazlitt, that sort of stuff. I do think that, and again, I haven't read his book. He might nitpick, he might highlight Mises within that. There is, I think, a distinction between Hayek and Mises on terms, but both consider themselves liberals. I think there's a very big distinction in the way that Mises uses the word liberal, which is very grounded within the concept of property rights, whereas I think Hayek allows for a little softness there. And this is where you've had criticisms of Hayek's political philosophy from Misesians. Now, again, Mises himself was very critical of anarchism, so that it might be self-serving in that I'm putting all the biases up front. But I do think there are some distinctions here between Hayek and Mises that lend themselves to that. And you think back, you have the very famous moment, right? The accuracy is a little bit in contention, but it's the Mont Pelerin Society where you have Hayek and you have Freeman and you have all these classical liberals of the Mont Pelerin Society, and Mises is storming out because of their sort of suggested, moderate sort of policies that Koppelman is sort of endorsing here as a reasonable man's approach to this left liberal free market project.
Okay, Andy, any comments there? Or are you just along for the ride?
No, I think he did have a good point talking about some of the people in our camp maybe being idealists. I would give him that, but aside from that, I don't really share his viewpoints on the state being a natural protector.
Okay, so let's start off with this one, because and then, by the way, if you do listen to it all the way through, I'm going to give Nick some credit for pushing back, perhaps more than some of the interviews, and I think this is an ideal one. Let's start it off here.
Let's start with the controlling metaphor of the book, burning down the house, because you start out and you come back to a story from a few years ago. What are you referencing in the title? Burning
So
down the
the story is an episode in Obion County, Tennessee. The county doesn't have its own fire department, and so it contracted with a nearby fire department, or more precisely, it made arrangements for its individual residents to contract with that nearby fire department for fire protection. And there was an aging man, Gene Kranick, had paid the fee every year, but he's getting old. He starts forgetting things. He forgets to make the payment one year, and a fire breaks out at his house. And they call the fire department, and they're told that, sorry, you didn't pay. You can't pay now. It's too late. There's nothing that we can do for you. And the fire department ends up coming, and they stand there and they watch his house burn down. They're there in case the house spreads to the houses of the neighbors who did pay, because that's what they understand their function to be. And this episode generates a furious debate in the press. And one of the points of agreement between the left and the right is that this is the true face of libertarianism. That you have writers on the left saying, look, this shows just how harsh and cruel unregulated capitalism is, and why we need to get away from capitalism and move toward a system that values people and not profits. And people on the right saying, the fire department did the right thing. We've got to get people to take personal responsibility for what they are doing.
So, private fire departments or not?
Yeah,
Do you know much about that story?
No, but I went and looked back afterwards, thinking I know Nick kind of pushes back on some specifics here. And of course, the issue here is not that, hey, this guy should be culpable for paying for fire services. It's the idea that it is a proper response to the market to stand by and let the whole thing burn. And again, as Koppelman goes on to mention, it's like, oh, but you know, the neighbors offered to pay. I mean, like there's people were trying to give this fire company money to do the job, and they refused to do so. And again, this was not a private fire department. This was a municipal run one with a user fee attached to it. But this is funny. It reminds me. There's a Paul Krugman. He has this example, and it's a failure of depression economics or something like that. And it's like his entire argument against libertarian, you know, like economic policy is grounded in this example of these group of DC couples that would exchange kind of homemade coupons for like it was like a babysitting co-op. And he was like, oh, well, yeah, at the end of the day, like nobody wanted to go out and use their coupons because they were afraid about needing it elsewhere. And so this little, you know, real life example shows why the proper, you know, response to this stuff is really expanding monetary policy, because as soon as they started making more coupons for each other, then everything got the juices flowing. And this is why I disagree with, you know, the idea that we need to have a tight money supplier. You know, he genuinely believes this, right? Like he really thinks that this example extrapolates this much larger philosophical worldview and works as a valid critique against an idea that he thinks is wrong. And of course, I mean, this is silly. Like his entire foundation, the entire purpose of the book is named after this example. Yeah. And it's like, is this really the example that, I mean, like it's silly. And I guess as we're going to see, like, I mean, it's the foundation point. It's the starting off point of this entire sort of argument, which kind of goes to just how questionably this book should really be considered.
So if let's say this was on NPR or some other one, I doubt the interviewer would have known necessarily the actual story. And it's even more. I saw a comment on the YouTube video that the neighbors tried to pay the fee for this guy, and the city is like, we can't do that, and so they wouldn't take it. So you can't.
I'm surprised I don't know this story, being a Tennessee boy myself.
Well, yeah, it's probably your dad.
No, I think there's probably some level of bureaucracy, right? That why didn't that town have their own private fire department? Why are they contracting outside of their town? And you know, I think there's more to it than just they weren't contractually obligated to take care of his house, like you said. There was people trying to pay.
What's the it's in San Bernardino County or Riverside County. It was a libertarian that was elected there, and he had run. He was a mayor, and he had helped. I don't know if it was privatize the fire department, or maybe it was their investments or something like that. Anyway, I think it could be done, and doesn't seem so far fetched. But let's keep going on.
Well, my biggest argument against this is that, I mean, we see it in all these other sectors, right? I mean, there's city trash pickup, and there's privatized trash pickup. So, I mean, you can do it. You can run these services privately.
That's correct. Okay, this one is kind of focus on Hayek, and we'll go from there.
About Hayek, your read of Hayek. Explain what was the core of Hayek's classical liberalism or libertarian philosophy.
So Hayek intervened at a time when there was a broad consensus on the part of an awful lot of folks that central economic planning was the only way to go in the future. That you would, there was a depression going on, and the United States was in this awful depression. Britain and France were not much better. The world's most admired economic managers were Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, because they were the ones who turned their economy around. And so there were lots of intellectuals who thought, we don't like Stalin and we don't like Hitler, but central economic planning is the way to go. And that was the position of the British Labour Party. And so Hayek understands that this has been debated in Austria. There had been a furious debate about whether it's possible to do the right calculations under socialism. And Hayek said there's already a literature showing that Karl Marx's vision of central economic planning isn't going to work, but it's all in German. And so the English speakers don't know about it. So I'm going to write a book trying to bring you folks up to speed about this, but Hayek adds something new that is not there in his mentors, which is the reason why he ultimately won a Nobel Prize, the capacity of markets to manage information. That there is so much information in a market. It's not just that you can't calculate all supply and all of the demand. It's not possible for any central planner to know it. You can only rely on the revealed preferences of consumers. You can't rely on surveys because the consumers themselves don't know what they're going to want. And so he argued in his book, The Road to Serfdom, in 1944, that any centralized economic planning is going to be both inefficient and tyrannical. And so you got to have markets if you are going to have a free society and a prosperous society. And
do you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you generally agree with that?
Yeah.
I mean, you define yourself as a pro-capitalism leftist, so it's the idea that markets do a pretty good job of coordinating people's activities through price and other kinds of information that gets shared. And, that's, being, whether you're a left, I mean, this is where the kind of dedication or devotion to liberalism is not necessarily, whether you can be left-wing liberal or a right-wing liberal, but it doesn't mean you're anti-capitalist necessarily.
The argument of the road to serfdom, I think, has carried the day in the American political mainstream. Socialism as state control of the means of production. I mean, you will see that still being argued a lot in Jacobin magazine, but it is not the position of Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Their views are you got to have a free market economy with a much bigger welfare state than you have now, which is consistent with Hayek. Hayek understands that and tries to show that markets are not going to give everybody what they deserve. They're just going to maximize production and be efficient. And
okay, so that now I don't like Hayek. Am I misreading Hayek?
So no, I mean, so there's a lot kind of thrown in there.
Yeah.
For one, I do think that so when we talk about Road to Serfdom, Road to Serfdom really was written as a reaction to what had been really the authoritarianism of the World War II era on both sides of the war. And within the Road to Serfdom, Hayek does allow for some vague sort of leeways to social welfare programs and things like this. And Hayek, he fleshes this out. His political theory is more fleshed out in Law, Liberty, Legislation, and the Constitution of Liberty later on, which I think can be adequately described as classical liberal, sort of political treatises. Hayek also, during his later career, when he becomes an American professor at the University of Chicago, his focus is political theory rather than the economics that he used to do with Mises in Vienna. So he's not entirely wrong about Hayek's having within his political framework a more robust role for the state. I think that again the Road to Serfdom though is the reason that was popular and that was his most significant work. And what's noteworthy is that really what made the Road to Serfdom as significant as it was actually a Reader's Digest, very simplified version of it, which was only focused on the way that economic central planning leads to full-on totalitarianism. So there's not any more of that. It doesn't have that sort of leeway sort of stuff. This is what made Hayek. Ayn Rand hated Hayek, his political philosophy, because she viewed as bad exactly what Koppelman here is identifying as the strength of Hayek. It's on this leeway. What really kind of grinds my gears and what I think makes it very easy to be skeptical of the entire project, though, is how he shifts this to Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ultimately have no profound difference in the foundational economic views than what Hayek would allow, right? Like, they might disagree on the size of the welfare state, but for the most part, both of them see markets as, useful. And while I do think that you can't adequately identify a left market-friendly orientation, right? I think this particularly plays out with like the yes in my backyard sort of policy arguments within particularly California and other blue areas. Maybe like the Niskanen Center, Matt Iglesias a little bit. So I mean, I think you can identify a wonkish, market-driven liberal welfare state. Kind of the Scandinavian model style of stuff. What you can't do is equate that to what the social democrats of the modern era in politics really want. Which, I mean, you look at something like Green New Deal. I mean, this is far closer to the managed, the faux private ownership that Mises identifies with a fascist economy, right? Because they want to regulate every single aspect of it. They don't necessarily want to nationalize it, right? So you have the facade of private ownership, and the fact that he can't distinguish between the two, to me, like it's a massive green light. So like that takes away any sort of legitimate, subtle, nuanced discussion about the virtues of libertarians talking about statecraft versus, let's say, state abolition, into something that is clearly a much larger Trojan horse to a more ideologically driven project.
Right. So, and you're right. So he says Hayek kind of gives leeway to the ability for the state to come in there, but yet the whole idea was, the social calculation, central planning. So, at what point do those two concepts push back against what he's saying Hayek would allow, which is the AOC, Bernie Sanders, Green New Deal? I mean, if that's not central planning to the most, I don't know what is.
And I think this is inherently the inadequacy of classical liberalism. Because what classical liberalism requires is a cultural framework that holds as its top priority individual liberty, right? And so that is a different culture than the machinations of the state. There's a cultural dynamic there, which brings us into questions of religion and social trust and all sort of stuff that Hayek really doesn't focus. I can admit to reading every page of his other two books, but I've seen his critiques made of Hayek and others elsewhere. But this is often pointed to as a blind spot of classical liberalism. And so even when you start making leeways, right, of even the provider, and I know it comes up later, I don't know if we're gonna get to it, but like, oh, well, Hayek would recognize a role for public education, and Hayek would recognize a role for collective public health, and so that might defend Operation Warp Speed and the different things in the name of public health during COVID, right? All of those have what is left out of that equation is what is the moral framework that these minarchists, these state institutions that we're allowing to fill the gaps that the market might not provide. There is a framework within that we can't just assume is going to be righteous or liberal or anything. And that's where, again, you have a lot of classical liberals, for example, in the modern sense, that will simultaneously be horrified at Ron DeSantis. I have to get him in there, controversially required, but Ron DeSantis banning restricting COVID mandates, right? Because that is an affront on private property rights, and that is in liberal by obviously, and yet support and yet would have no issue or would be aghast at the idea of repealing the Civil Rights Act,
right?
Which defended which takes away the ability for employers to engage in freedom of association with certain privileged groups of the state. And so as soon as you start creating state privileged institutions, that leads to these larger issues that require more than simply sort of an institutional sort of analysis here. And so I think that is these are some of this is some of the arguments that have always kind of gone back and forth. And these are decades old, good old classic retro libertarian debates. But I don't think that modern times has clearly defined Hayek as being the righteous one here. And again, I think his attempt to try to extrapolate that to some contemporary issues, how identify some inherent weaknesses there.
Right. So we got Drew says, Tho and Andy look kind of alike. And it might be the hair. I'm the total opposite. We've got a weird, it looks like two, is it mullets against old man hair? I don't know what we got here.
So, South rise again.
I know. So I like the South. I just don't live it. Okay. Let's keep going here so we can get through all this here.
Just real quick, I wanted to say it seems like such an arbitrary jump. You can, once you start justifying these smaller state programs, you can justify larger ones. And if you're going to justify the welfare state, well, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. You look around at what the welfare state is today, and is it really helping anybody, or is it hurting more people than it helps?
Yeah, and particularly when you combine it with democracy, and Hayek was a defender of democracy, so was Mises. I'm not trying to, but you patronage is a part of political power. And the second you start opening the door to welfare states with a democracy, you suddenly, it requires a political class that is willing to prioritize some sort of higher virtue over their own self-interest. It's like that doesn't really work well. Like, and that's again, this is where I think classical liberalism has very real issues. And again, Mises avoids most of this by again defining his liberalism with property rights, and it gives far fewer concessions here. So that is where I'm not trying to say that Mises was not a liberal. He was, but the Misesian liberal was not very much. It was not a Hayekian liberal. It was not a Lockean liberal. Like, I think there's a distinct difference there that's important.
Okay. All right. Let's go to the next tier.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and I say this is the argument of the road to serfdom. I mean, one of the things that I hadn't read it since I was in college. A few years ago, I wrote a book about the healthcare litigation,
right.
Where my argument was that there were libertarians like Randy Barnett, who professor at Georgetown, who were trying to import their conception of liberty into the Constitution, where it actually isn't. And that was what initially got me interested in libertarianism. So I reread The Road to Serfdom for the first time since college, and I was surprised to find that there really wasn't anything that I disagreed with. And I didn't think there really is anything in there that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are going to.
Well, you would disagree, or they would disagree, that Hayek's idea of like what the size of social welfare spending would be lower than theirs, probably.
Well, but he doesn't make such commitments in The Road to Serfdom.
Right.
It's kind of vague in The Road to Serfdom.
Yeah.
Later on, he worries that anything above bare social minimum that is equally applied to everybody is going to put us on the slippery slope to socialism.
Right.
What's really doing the work there is a prediction about political psychology. If the state is allowed any discretion at all to set different levels of income, that is going to slide us into socialism.
Right.
So if you adopt Social Security in the 90s, that Social Security is going to take us to central economic planning.
Right.
I don't know if you really want to say anything more about that one, but that to me, it makes me feel like if that's his reading, and I don't know that if he's, I think he's well-intentioned gentleman. He's an attorney, and so am I, by the way. And what we try to do is, and it's kind of, looked frowned upon if you're quoting a case as an example that has contrary views to what you're trying to push, and you're not really pointing out the both sides of it. It could be a problem. And it feels like to me that he is cherry picking in a sense, and he's really trying to mold Hayek into justifying what he wants here.
Right. And Koppelman, I looked out after this interview. He had this big debate with Barnett on kind of the issue of Obamacare. Yeah. So that's one of his hobby horses for a while now. He makes a great argument against Hayekianism, for the most part. And it's actually it's interesting because when I was up in D.C., the first time I ever heard an Austrian economist actually referenced by a member of Congress, and Ron Paul was one of the members, it was Barney Frank. And Barney Frank actually printed out, he's a great theatrical member of Congress, and he actually printed out copies of The Road to Serfdom, and he handed it to the members of the press that were attending this hearing that was defending one of the Obama-era regulatory agencies that was created, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And he made the point, like, even Hayek would agree that this agency was important because it's helping protect people from fraud and yada, yada, yada. And so, again, I do not think that Hayek himself would defend the Obamacare Act, particularly, just the explicit fraud by which it was argued in favor of the public. But this is what Rothbardians and Hoppe famously, pissed off Bedke over at Mason because he called Hayek a socialist at one point. But this is what you get. This is what Hayekians, this is what people will utilize Hayek to justify.
This is what the problem when look, three white guys, you guys all look the same person at different stages of their life. Jose. Thank you.
What's up, Jose? I was going to say, it seems like, you could justify a lot of a monopoly privilege through the regulatory state with the same argument.
And they try to do.
Yeah. Okay, this is we're cruising along here. Transfer payments with Hayek
in the system. And any system that is filled with chance, you need to be willing to help people who, through no fault of their own, or maybe even some fault of their own, just end up on the losing end of things.
That's the fundamental division between him and, for example, the Ayn Rand of Atlas Shrugged, or predecessors like William Graham Sumner, who thought that markets give people what they deserve. Hayek's argument was that when you think about what people deserve, it is backward looking. We look at what they've done in the past. and think that good things done in the past should be rewarded. Whereas markets are forward-looking. So, I work for years to develop some fabulous product that's going to make everybody better off. Let's say, some drug for some bad disease. And, I finally do it. And then 2 weeks later, some lazy lout happens, luckily, to stumble across something that's just as good as my drug with worse side effects. And I'm out of business, and I should be out of business because no one wants my product, and it's a waste of resources to produce it. So it's efficient to be forward-looking and ask what people are going to want in the future, but it doesn't reward virtue. And I think pertinently for the contemporary American economy, there are an awful lot of blue-collar workers who, they faithfully worked in the auto factories. And then globalization happened, and the information revolution happened. And now auto factories don't need a lot of manual laborers anymore. All the work is done by robots. And this is not the fault of the workers. The workers did not suddenly become lazier. The economy changed.
Would you...
And then I wanted to play that part there because at some point he references multiple things about employers or industry changing, and at some point it's the no fault of their own, and then later on the government needs to come in and save them. So I just would just kind of preface it. Anything there that caught your eye?
Well, of course, this is something that resonates with both the left and the right on this, which is that the creative destruction, if you will, of the markets, create victims from this component. The problem is that when you start when we start allowing for the government to try to intervene with what are these natural shifts within industrial capacity, the division of labor, and things like that, you end up creating again these different special interest groups that become protected interests, and the consequence or ever building entitlement programs. Again, this is again it's something that starts very small, decades prior, and gets into something that's becomes completely unsustainable. Again, particularly within the sort of democratic system that Hayek thought was necessary. And you do have certain types of you might have pension schemes and private ways of handling worker programs within a corporation, but this sort of dynamic, again, it's he has a bias here in favor of these policies, and therefore trying to utilize Hayek as a justification for what are his underlying political preferences. And again, I don't think they're necessarily there's not much to it rather than that.
Andy?
I think he kind of lightly touches on some of his more philosophical backgrounds, and I don't know a lot about Hayek, but I'd be interested to know what maybe his philosophical background would be.
Who, Koppelman or?
Yeah, Koppelman. It seems like he's kind of touching on he's talking about Randian ethics, I guess, as sort of markets give you what you deserve, but what is his oppositional view to that? And where does it come from?
I get the feeling going through here that he kind of describes himself as a left-leaning free market, libertarian-ish type. So I think he might have issue. And I haven't read all his stuff. I know he did a bunch of things about gay marriage and religious freedoms, and I don't know where he lays in that. So maybe figuratively and literally. So maybe
it's anti-traditional.
Right. So maybe that's skewed him in a way where he's trying to get the free markets, but he also wants to have his other ways. So I don't know.
I believe he was very influenced by John Rawls.
Okay.
I think that comes up during the interview in ways that has liberal connotations and things like that. Right. But I think that's kind of his guiding framework.
I did skip some of the Rawls stuff just because I thought we'd try to stick with some of the other. But the Rawls, Lockean, and there's a few other ones that he talks about there. Did you feel that his interpretation of them was correct?
I think it's fine. And again, he's not creating anything out of whole cloth. He is coming from he's coming from a liberal philosophical tradition, and that's fine. He's not engaging with any of this in bad faith. Again, I don't know to the extent that if Hayek were with us today, he would. I think Hayek would have some very different takes on what Hayekianism is than what Koppelman is saying it is. But you could say that just about. I'm sure Mises would probably disagree with some stuff that Misesians assigned to him as well. But he's not creating much here out of whole cloth. What he's actually doing is simply again highlighting critiques that others have made, friendly critiques often against Hayek from a libertarian perspective, simply because of the sort of conclusions that he's drawing.
I haven't. I went through Road to Serfdom years ago. Okay, and I don't
It's a
remember.
horrible read.
Okay, so it's not. Is it a warning, or is it a here's our end goal? Because sometimes the way he's talking about Hayek, it's almost like, hey, this is. I don't know. Serfdom doesn't sound like a good thing to me.
Yeah, no. It's definitely a warning against managed economies, and in this he sounds like it's the two big books at the time, like the contrast. So you have Hayek, which was definitely a warning against the consequences of this sort of managerial progress of both sides of the war, and at the same time, a little bit prior to Road to Serfdom, you have Burnham's managerial revolution.
Yeah.
And Burnham's managerial revolution is pretty much a bring it on sort of viewpoint. He has no time for capitalism. He says that there's the unemployment rate that we have will never be solved by laissez-faire, yada yada yada. And so within that, you have both of them are identifying very similar phenomenon. Hayek is very much warning, hey, look, this leads to a totalitarian dystopia. Burnham says, no, we need to embrace it in order to avoid the totalitarian dystopia of true socialism, right? So that is a very interesting contrast between the two there. It's just that there is there's some vagueness to Hayek's Road to Serfdom message that does open itself out to particularly the role of social service platforms, more so than the regulation. And again, this does play into, again, some of the issues out there where, again, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, I know that Road to Serfdom was criticized by like John Sachs, I believe was a Harvard economist. He's the one I think has said some good things about foreign policy recently. He had an article back, I believe in the mid 2000s, where he was like, oh, well, Hayek was wrong because if you look at Sweden and these Scandinavian countries, well, they have a very high social safety net, but they're not authoritarian hellscapes, right? The difference there would be, again, this kind of goes to the Hayekian distinction there between a robust safety net versus a stronger regulatory regime. And I haven't read a lot on Hayek's regulatory views. I know Rothbard's views, and I know Koppelman attacks them. Is for example, his solution to pollution, and so these large sort of externality things was through torts and using a legal response rather than a regulatory response. But I do think that when we talk when we're getting to the market versus safety net component, again, this is where his comments about AOC and Bernie Sanders are completely insane. Yeah. Because they want to use a very heavy hand on the regulatory state, regardless of their view of the social safety net. You can argue that that is not necessarily a road to serfdom created by having a robust safety net, particularly against some of the unique characteristics that Scandinavian countries have at least enjoyed for a while, perhaps less so today, versus the more hands-on regulatory infringement upon property rights environment within the actual business environment within these countries.
Okay, so just kind of a thing on there, and maybe I'll get back into it a little bit. Is it kind of like the definition of I'm a minarchist, which could be anywhere from the edge of anarchy all the way up to Mao? I mean, it just depends on how much of that min really you want to define.
Yeah, to a certain extent. And again, like Mises was a minarchist, and in fact, he was a very strong defender of the necessity of the state. Basically, to really try to emphasize that we need a very wise state, and that was capable of the protection of property rights and yada yada yada. I know, I'm by no means I've not read Robert Nozick's masterpiece that is his response to Rothbardianism. Yeah. Where he about his own Night Watchman state. But
Anarchy, State, and Utopia.
Yeah, I've not read that book, so I can't. I'm not going to even try to comment on it. David Gordon will kill me. But that is a defense of minarchism, and that kind of arising from responding to Rothbardian individual anarchy, and then Hayek allows for much more. Yeah. And again, you see this with again, that's where you get to the Constitution of Liberty. That's where you get to law, liberty, and legislation. He does allow for much more than kind of that Night Watchman state.
Okay, on the next one here, this is just Hayek, COVID, and regulation stuff.
And so, I mean, what you're arguing is that Hayek effectively is doing this as well, and that this is in a libertarian debate or a libertarian tradition that Hayek represents, that actually is a call for the state to provide certain basic necessities to people so that they can participate fully in life.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, I mean, one example of a public good that is salient right now that I think what has given minimalist staters a problem is, we just had this natural phenomenon, this event that, quite possibly, it's now controversial, wasn't anybody's fault. Pandemics break out from time to time. That's something that happens in nature. And the state had this big pile of money that it collected through taxation. It confiscated it from individuals. And with that money raised by taxation, it embarked on this massive research program to come up with a vaccine for COVID. And it succeeded. And I've been vaccinated. If people who are listening to this haven't gotten their bivalent booster, go get it. But
now you've just lost half the audience. But Operation Warp Speed is something that you would argue is consistent with, certainly with liberal political philosophy and a Hayekian libertarianism. I don't disagree with you. I think it is consistent.
It's not just the obstacles to my freedom are not just other people violating my rights.
Yeah. No, and but again, this is also within a Hayekian conception of libertarianism. There is such a thing as public health that the government can act upon, or act through in order to.
Okay. Questions here. One, hope you're boosted. Take that. Two. Now, maybe I misunderstood that, but he's saying that Hayek allows for the government to step in and regulate to get things done like warp speed? Or is he saying warp speed was actually the benefit of the government reducing all the federal regulation to allow this to come to market in a quicker fashion?
I'm not sure if he picked up on that specific nuance making that point. I think that he was simply highlighting that a Hayekian appreciation for rights in the role of the state would allow for extraordinary measures for the protection of public health. And again, this is why, again, he's gone through the same experience that we have, and his interpretation of the last 2 years, however long it's been, is so disconnected from anything that I've experienced that this goes to the limits of what persuasion can really accomplish in the defense of liberty. Because again, he's describing something that I think all of us are just cringing at.
Yeah.
And the problem is that when you allow, so you're going to have some viewpoint guiding the role of the state, no matter even with this Hayekian model, and so the conclusions that state derives from, it's not going to come from some sort of scientific, economic calculation of con and loss, right? Like, you have two different people that can come with two completely different conclusions here. And again, this goes into, I think, some of the underlying weaknesses with what you allow, and what Hayek will defend in political theory.
Okay, I think we're going to move. Andy, do you have anything on that? Okay, you're muted. So
I was just going to say
some of the best
real quick
stuff you've said yet.
So, real quick, I just want to say this kind of touches on some of the more cultural aspects. To me, this is like what I would call like communal libertarianism. Like you have to wear a mask to protect my freedoms, and that whole spiel. And to me, I view it as like a form of cultural imperialism.
Let me ask you though, and you can go off on this, because he wrote an article that I did read, and Penn Jillette made the same, which I think was horrible analogy, which is drunk driving. So he's assuming everybody is a drunk driver on the road, and if you really want to take his point, you would just remove the drunk drivers. I mean, it didn't make sense to me, right? If we all have COVID, or you think everyone does, you remove the people that maybe are the worst about it. But I don't like the drunk driving analogy. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, it's true. Lou Rockwell, respecter, would defend drunk driving. That's here or
right.
there.
Well, besides that, though.
No, I mean, the thing is, though, is that, again, what's important to understand is that there's nothing here that he's saying that is incompatible with the way that most very serious libertarian intellectuals viewed COVID. His view is indistinguishable from Tyler Cohen it's indistinguishable than the process of the Cato Institute that had its own vaccine mandate for its employees as operating procedure, right? So as much as we this sounds crazy to us, he is identifying what is a widely accepted view of public health and the appropriateness of the state and public responsibility and duty within the context of liberty that is accepted by arguably the majority of accomplished, credentialed libertarian scholars and whatever makes up a libertarian intellectual elite. That's what it is.
You mean losers?
Sure, there you go. Let's keep going.
Beneficiaries of Coke welfare.
We start to finally get into some of the Rothbard stuff, and
but that was libertarianism.
Yeah.
Libertarianism now, and I believe you used the term mutant or mutated into something else.
Yep.
And like most mutations in nature, the mutations are not good. There's all the Marvel superheroes who are mutants and they get powers.
Yeah.
Most mutants in nature just die or have like 3 eyes and then give up the ghost. What has
Or red
happened
hair.
to libertarianism over the past 50 or so years?
So it has become a kind of reflective anti-statism that opposes the provision of public goods, that cripples the capacity of the state to deal with public bads, individual harms that can't be attributed to anybody who you can sue or penalize, such as, I think most saliently now, the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And, pollution generally. Each small bit of pollution doesn't violate anyone's rights, and you can't point to anyone whose rights are violated. But if you can't do anything about it, it will render the planet uninhabitable. And so the only way to control it is by government either restricting the amount of pollution that is produced, or I think probably the most effective thing that you can do about climate change right now is what we did with the COVID vaccine, subsidizing research into cheap, clean energy. Because, it's clear right now the only thing that's going to prevent the burning of coal in third world countries is to come up with cheap, clean energy and hand it to them on a platter.
all right.
As someone from a deeply Appalachian state, I hate that he brought up coal there.
Well, it's
I hate this paper on the wall, motherfuckers. I'm just going to
to me, it's trying to bring up the maybe the most the nuanced one. When he talks about, I think in David Gordon's thing too, the ledge scenario or the safety, the way out ones that you have a moral issue that Rothbard may come in here. So he's trying to bring in this. Climate is a rough one, but once again, he does mention warp speed, which I must emphasize. How long does it typically take for a drug to get to market through the federal years? That was reduced. That was laid back. So warp speed, maybe not the best example. You're muted.
You're muted though.
Let's unmute you. There you go.
Okay, yeah. There is an aspect there of both, I think, a direct subsidization and perhaps most important and relevant, I think, perhaps to the pollution issue, which is the liability aspect.
Yeah.
With warp speed in particular, because I do think, I there is kind of an uncomfortable thing when people talk about, oh, it's not FDA approved, and I'm like, and that's a good argument in favor of it.
Right.
But again, his straight away his go-to on why the Rothbardian framework doesn't work is climate change. Right. Yeah. So again, he's working backwards where he has, normie shitlib, larger political viewpoints, and he's trying to use Hayek as an appeal to get, libertarians on board with just underlying, generic political worldviews. And I do think that if so Rothbard, again, he does have, again, some it's not robust, and it's not, I think he has just a couple articles in it, but he does have a torts argument for pollution, and of course within, if we want to go the pollution aspect, one of the biggest polluters is the state that enjoys certain privileges. It's larger entities that have certain state created carve-outs within it. There are limitations to how citizens can bundle together to deal with some of these externalities that, for when you have provable priced in costs. But again, ultimately though, is that, when you have a Hayekian state, particularly within the one that Koppelman would allow, if science the science community, if the intellectual class concedes that something is a big bad problem, then it's a green light on the road to serfdom. Mm-hmm. You know, the road to serfdom in this case is not war, but it's the war on climate change. It's the war on COVID. It's like if the entire Hayekian strategy, if what Hayek is supposed to do is to stop the road to serfdom, Koppelman is making an argument that you move military from the equation, you create a social good, that justifies the road to serfdom. And I appreciate how well he's willing to articulate it, and it's his well-versedness in figures like Rothbard that makes it, I think useful for illustration. It's also very telling in many ways.
I mean, you could have said Trump could have come in and used like the Obamacare analogy or justification to say everyone should have a weapon in their house because there's a safety concern, and therefore the government is forcing you to buy a product in a sense. Now maybe that's not quite the right analogy, but you can see where those kind of things spread. Okay.
No, absolutely.
And yeah, the tort idea, he does mention that at some point in here about lawsuits, not, there's too much money, you're not going to have a good solution for that. Anyway, well, maybe we'll get to that. I'm going to have to probably skip some of these just on time and try to get to the bulk of the Rothbard stuff. So let me pull this one here. Okay, I think we're finally starting to get, and mutation. Mutations aren't always a bad thing, would you say? Especially as far as philosophical arguments. Slavery used to be bad, now it's good, and I think we've mutated our thoughts on that. I mean, so a mutation isn't necessarily a bad thing, would you say?
Slavery went from bad to good? Huh? You said slavery was bad, now
I forgot I was talking to the South. All right.
Ayn Rand, Robert Nozick, and Murray Rothbard, especially Murray Rothbard. Can you talk about the conceptions of Rand, Nozick, and Rothbard and how those have kind of taken over the libertarian movement? I mean, that as you say it.
So Rothbard, who had been working in obscurity in libertarian think tanks for decades before libertarianism became big in the early 1970s, is basically an anarchist. He thinks that we should be able to have a capitalist system with no state at all, because since there are gains from trade, he agrees with Hayek about that, it's in everyone's interest to live together in peace and prosperity. And so we can, if there are just private police forces who contract with people, private initiative will do everything much better and more efficiently than the state will, because there's competition, and competition produces higher quality products. And so that was his basic political vision. And so anything that moves us in that direction, this is going to sound familiar from the program of the contemporary Republican Party, anything that lowers taxes makes things better. Anything that limits government regulation makes things better. Whatever shrinks government is going to be an advance for human freedom. Mm-hmm. Now, Rothbard, seems to have been a very charismatic figure, had an enormous influence on a number of the people.
You never met him or interacted directly with him?
I've seen videos, but I never met. I think of the people who I write about, the only one who I have personally met is Richard Epstein, who is a delightful person. I critique him in the book, but I like him a lot. One of the people who Rothbard influences is a graduate student at Princeton named Robert Nozick, who ends up being a professor of philosophy at Harvard. And Nozick starts from Rothbard's premises and tries to show how it is possible to start from a Rothbardian baseline where everyone's got a private protective association and have a state emerge through a series of legitimate transactions. But the state that legitimately emerges is a minimal state that protects people's persons and property and does nothing else.
And that's is called a night watchman state, or minarchy, right? Because it's a minimal, the bare minimum state. So it's moving away from Rothbard to something where there is some public fisc that's going on.
But it's a minimal state. Nozick and Rothbard debated about whether this was appropriate. Nozick's book is also early 1970s. Anarchy, State, and Utopia is published in 1973. Again, this vision of an absolutely minimal state.
Any wrong interpretations there of Rothbard? I mean, he doesn't go too deep, really.
Right. I mean, I love the idea that Rothbard's shaping the generic Republican platform. I mean, that's fun.
Right.
But Yeah, I mean, but no. I mean, Rothbard, he had the famous analogy, right? If you could push the button and abolish a state, would you push that button? And his response is, I twisted my finger pushing the button. And that's Rothbard's strategy to a T, and it very much marks his entire political strategy. I mean, guiding from really the 1950s till when he dies in the mid 1990s. And there is an element within there, and I think this might reflect some of these subtle differences. I mean, not so subtle differences between Hayek and Rothbard. Is that Hayek, did have, he came from a very accomplished, privileged career path, right? Teaching at the University of Vienna, being in a very powerful Viennese political position with Mises at the Chamber of Commerce there, studying business cycles. Being a part of the London School of Economics, which was very prominent, allowed him to have, his debates with Keynes, being able to teach at the University of Chicago. Hayek's larger strategic viewpoint for the promotion of liberty very much was one that revolved around convincing the intellectual elites, people like Andrew Koppelman, right? People in significant institutions, that are smarter than your average bear, and therefore can logically think through all of the complications and recognize the pros and the cons of a free order versus a state-controlled order. Rothbard said that this was completely wrong. Rothbard always had this sort of inner populist thing, even though he kind of grew up in kind of like a scrappy, Jewish family. He was like a boxer at a young age because he could get picked on in school. He went to Columbia and great schools, but he always was kept down with academic positions. Actually, interesting tidbit is that Milton Friedman actually offered him a position at the University of Chicago very early in his career, and Rothbard hated flying, and so he didn't go. But for the most part, he kind of had to work his way up through this libertarian movement. He was right where Rothbard's career, for the most part, was in obscurity. Dependent upon kind of libertarian think tank monies. Was the Volcker Fund was a major fund at the time, and a few others. But there is this sort of scrappy populist anti-elitism aspect to this, guiding some of the ways that this galaxy brain Rothbard would engage in some of these battles, and I think that helps fuel perhaps some of the cynicism that Koppelman is identifying here, and may also explain some of the, let's call it naivete, if we want to be harsh, but that Hayek might have had for the possibility for these institutions. And so I think there is some relevance within the biographical novel narratives of both of these men that guide some of the differences on display here.
Is any of it the fact that I imagine Hayek came from Germany or Austria, just like Mises, and so they come to the U.S. and they're under such a more restrictive life. They come over here and maybe that's free, and they're like, oh, well, so we want to warn against this, but I mean, we don't want to go too far. Whereas Rothbard is growing up in the U.S. and sees that it could be restrictive, but it could be even much less. I don't know.
I think that there might be a degree of that. And of course, you can contrast as well the difference between Hayek and Mises himself. And part of that is that Mises was, again, the famous, you're all a bunch of socialists line, where, we have freemen in the Mont Pelerin Society kind of embracing a lot more of role of the state. And so Hayek had a much more accomplished career in the United States, taking this sort of position that he had, whereas Mises, still was very much the sort of intransigent, uncompromising force that helped. It was not an anarchist, right? But helped kind of motivate some of the Rothbardian, digging in your heels at times to take on things. And so I think that you might be able to identify there again the differences in notoriety between Mises and Hayek. There as well might go to some of the differences in the way that they approach some of these political questions.
Yeah, and not only that, but Hayek ended up getting the Nobel Peace Prize, or the Peace Prize in economics for his work, which ingratiates him a little bit to everyone else. So
and he got it right after Mises died, and there's some notion there that they waited until Mises died in order to not give it to him. There's also a funny, I gotta share it, is that he shared it with a socialist economist named Gunther Myrdal. And it made for a very awkward scene because it is reported that Hayek had familiar relations with Gunther Myrdal's wife. prior to. Hayek was a dog, which again, something perhaps
well,
some fun stories there as well.
Maybe we found the connection to some of this. And I didn't know that Rothbard was the Mr.
I can respect Hayek now.
Yeah, I didn't know.
He also taught at the University of Arkansas for a bit, so he has some Southern pride. He married his cousin at the same time, which I don't know works there, but that's there's all sorts of layers.
That ties right in to Southern tradition. I'm kidding. I didn't know Rothbard was the Mr. T of the Austrian economics world by not liking to fly. That's pretty solid to hear about this. Well, okay, let's keep moving on here.
Of property. In a Lockean system, and then where do you think that goes wrong in either Rawls or Nozick or Rothbard?
So Locke is trying to show that there can be some basis for rights other than as a gift to the king. He's writing in the 1680s to try to justify resistance to royal power, and he argues, we didn't really need a king to have a just state. You could imagine us in a state of nature with no government at all, and there we can develop property rights because I can, take a piece of land, farm the land. I've mixed my labor with the land. Nobody else has. If you try to collect from my land what I've grown, you are asking for the fruit of my labor, which you haven't got any right to. That's already wrong in the state of nature. You are wronging me in the state of nature. But in order to secure people's rights, when people come into dispute, we've got to have a state that can adjudicate the disputes that we are going to have about the rights that we already have. And so for Locke, the purpose of the state is to protect these rights, which include rights of property that we already have. And so then the Lockeans split. Rothbard and Nozick, each in a different way, say that's how we should think about the state now. The state exists in order to protect our property. That's what it's for. And it's violating our rights if it redistributes any of the property that we have. Rawls is going to say, this is not the world that we've actually lived in. Whatever wealth we've accumulated in this world is the product of a complex system of social cooperation. It's not, you can't point to anyone who farmed their own land without any help from anybody else. It's not a complex system of cooperation. It's very hard to figure out who deserves what. What we want to do is come up with rules of cooperation that are fair to everybody, that give everybody a stake in the system. And the problem with Locke's vision is that people can, while you take existing property rights as a baseline without asking for the justification of those property rights, you can end up with rules that say only people who have a certain amount of property get to vote. And that's not a relationship among equals. If people are going to be equal, then they all have to have a stake in the system. And that means that the distribution of property has to be something that you can justify to everybody.
Okay, so that's
there
somewhat...
we go. The egalitarianism on full display.
There you go.
Yeah, no, I mean, pretty much that. I mean, that becomes, a very clear motivating ethos here for Koppelman, that, everyone should have, that equality is the guiding arm of justice. And, I understand why people have that view, but I think nature does not demonstrate that's what it makes it harder to defend.
Yeah. Okay. We're gonna dig in here. Sorry, I had to delete this one.
I'm saying in Hayek, for instance, the idea of regulation, it needs to be defended, et cetera. But the idea that there will be some form of regulation. Like you might be able to show that you don't need it in this particular instance, but he's not in a way that in a Rothbardian system in particular, that's gone. We are at taking something to a logical extreme and then pronouncing that as where we need to live.
Well, Hayek's logic is not of the best. He's not a great logician. I'm sorry, Rothbard's logic is not of the best, I meant to say. But Hayek lays down conditions for regulation. In order for there to be regulation, there has to be some market failure, some externality, positive or negative, or there's got to be some public good that isn't being supplied, or some systemic problem, some problem that the market can't solve. And if the market can solve it, then you let the market solve it. And modern heirs of Hayek, like Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek, or for that matter, many of the writers for Reason magazine, I think perform a valuable service by pointing out ways in which particular places where the state has stuck its nose into something that private arrangements can do better. And the hypothesis that we can do better than have the state do this or that thing is a hypothesis always worth testing.
Okay, I just wanted to bring this up here. Phobe says, in fairness, they are discussing the musings of other people. Yes, but as you can see, like at the end there, he does put in his own little bits, and Nick is as well. So I understand that he's given a context for some of this. And then, okay, so is Rothbard's logic waning?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've had some of my own sort of thoughts of late of what is the validity of statecraft as independent from a pure sort of anarchic viewpoint, right? And Rothbard does too, to a certain extent. Like in his later years, again, particularly in the 90s, he's got a very interesting article called What to Do Until Privatization Comes, where he talks about like, oh, well, the solution isn't to just simply make everything go horrible, right? There is a role here for trying to manage society given the government that exists in a way that optimizes outcomes, and having different priorities there, that, and the other. And so I think Rothbard's political philosophy over time kind of becomes addresses some points that he might have neglected in his more purely sort of philosophic libertarian stage. But again though, like I think you have to start from the foundation of what is the proper role. What are we trying to achieve with this state itself? And so from the Rothbardian perspective, it's always guided by that sort of Lockean notion of individual rights and the protection of property, rather than this sort of broader social notion, right? That cooperation and the utility. Even though Rothbard would not defend things in a utilitarian perspective, Mises would. And so, Mises would argue that a sound defense and foundation within property rights as the cornerstone of allowing for the division of labor to elevate and maximize and create the best outcomes that everyone enjoys is an extension of taking that very Rothbardian focus on property rights as the guiding function of the state. Koppelman's arguing that, and he would argue that Hayekian political libertarianism allows for exploring other social truths that perhaps are best achieved through markets, right? Maybe it's better to have your beloved COVID vaccine come from big pharmaceutical companies rather than the state itself creating it, but ultimately gives enough leeway to the pursuit of these larger social goods.
A question. So what kind of threw me into being this whole libertarians thing to the extent I am, which is down the Rothbard train, is listening to him and reading his book. And he's talking about, and I was going to play the clip, but we'll skip it here. But they're talking about his logic, where he's having that famous discussion speech where he's talking about hanging out with some friends and they're lefties, and something big came about that night. He thinks back about it, and they were talking about, he said you shouldn't have this, you shouldn't have this as far as government, and they said, well, but then why can't you have this and this and this? And they named some other things, and he starts to make the realization that if you're gonna say the municipality here, you got to say it here, and so what's to not? And his logical conclusion is you abolish everything. Is that problematic? Is that still worth saying? And is that to me that does have a logical conclusion? You can't. At some point, you're always like, oh, but I don't like what you're doing, but I'm okay in enforcing and coming up with my own regulations. So how does that work in logic-wise? And I'm not saying necessarily in the real world.
No, this is why I still have no problem considering myself a Rothbardian anarchist from a philosophical position. I don't think that there is any civic good that the performance is predicated upon a monopoly upon its service, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is I think where things get the most interesting is the discussion of law and court systems. But there's also very fascinating research about polycentric legal structures. Police services I think are pretty easy. You have and we see functioning private contractor departments and things like that. And so I think the aims, right? The aims of Rothbardian society of Rothbardian anarchism is not the elimination of governance, right? Nor is it the abolishment of hierarchy and the promotion of some sort of liberation in the aim of humanitarian egalitarianism that personifies some of the desires of left-wing anarchism and the like. What Rothbardian anarchism truly is trying to create the most effective governing structure to provide vital services inherent to the protection of property rights and other vital aspects of society, and that allowing that to be contracted out voluntarily creates the most meritocratic form, right? That there is no solution to governance, to wise governance, and that meritocratic market rewards are going to be the best way of establishing that over, hereditary monarchy or democracy or some of these other political forms of consent. And I think there's still a great amount of truthfulness to that in the abstract. The issue, of course, is how do you get from a democracy to that system, right? You have a lot of people that are not prepared for that. A lot of people who would lose, right? You have certain aspects of society that would lose if they were forced to take care of themselves, if they were forced to contract all themselves. And so, from a practical point of view, and this might going a little bit further from what you're getting at, but the way that I kind of think about it, right, is that where Rothbardian anarchism has its most application in the real world, and I do not think it's absolutely crazy or impractical, but where it has its application is with like opt-in societies. So think about, not so much the Free State Project, because you're still kind of working into New Hampshire and kind of existing political framework there. But that's where you have interest in seasteading. That's where you have interest in sort of international free cities, where you might have like a Gulch type approach. Maybe somebody buys a whole lot of land in some place that doesn't have people, right? That often also opens the door to libertarian scams, but so goes the zest of life. So it's an opt-in society where people are opting into the agreement to be a part of a contracted governing service world, which might itself have, if you think about it, you're opting into Peter Thiel's, seasteading, fantasy island. You're not going in there with the expectation that you're going to be able to start up a competing governmental service to whatever that contract, to Peter Thiel. Right? You are voluntarily opting into that environment with the recognition that you don't have the authority to start a competing firm. And so I think that's where the stuff actually plays up. The issue is where anarchism becomes a sort of an extinction, F the man sort of approach to things. And that's where I think it gets into just sort of this inherent anti-authoritarianism and the rejection of hierarchy. And that's where you get to some more left-wing deviations and things like that. But if hopefully that's just not an unproductive rant. But I think that's the distinguishing between the abstract of Rothbardian theory to practice there.
And actually, Phillips has separated theory from practice, say, Tyler. Well, for some, yes. And my view on the theory, the importance of it is, I don't think a lot of people, for whatever the Republicans that you're working with, though, which would be for me a lot of my family, they've never thought about this. It's right. Kind of like the Hayek idea of, well, we go here, and then you have to have. Once you start to think about that, maybe in your own life and in your practice and in your voting, you start to go, whoa, we don't necessarily have to have the government do this and this and this, because I've actually thought about it from a theoretical point of view, and it starts to make sense. So that to me, and I was just going off of the realism of where we are.
Yeah, and you see it play out in some sort of interesting, Sandy Springs, Georgia contracted out a whole bunch of sort of boring, and that's all the things that, the reason why people don't think about this sort of stuff is that for the most part, really what is being discussed here is very, very boring stuff.
Yeah.
Right. It's who picks up the trash. It's not some sort of it's not the sort of battles that you want to make a movie about narrative wise, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's this very interesting dynamic where the questions of statecraft at the municipal level are almost completely hijacked by this network, the League of Cities, where you get elected to a local government office and you go there and you learn. It's not partisan. It's like, oh, you're going to the Democratic municipal boot camp or Republican boot camp. It is sold as expertise, nonpartisan. This is just the way cities operate. And so you have a lot of municipal officials that are doing the job that aren't even actively thinking about what actually it is municipal government really, you know, it's like, oh well, you know, this is just how things go. This is just, you know, the idea of thinking about any sort of concept of different model, unless you have someone really motivated on trying to problem solve, which unfortunately is not general. The majority of people that get into public office, they don't even think about these things if they're in the arena itself, which again goes to some of the uphill battles that we have.
Okay, I'll play another quote, but this is, I'm sorry, you nerds got a problem with Alongside Night. Kevin Sorbo was fine. It was horrible acting. Let's just be honest here. I don't know if you've ever seen that, though.
I have not.
Okay, you save yourself from that. Let's play this last one up here. And we got so much, but I think we'll kind of close out with this one.
Rothbard go wrong? And Rothbard is really, and you know, push back if you don't want it to be characterized as, if Hayek is the hero, Rothbard is the villain of this book. Where does Rothbard go wrong?
I think that Rothbard is way too optimistic about what a world will be like without state power. And you're really starting with the police. You know, the idea that there are gains from trade if various armed groups in the same geographical area don't fight with each other. It's been tested over and over again. He calls them private police forces, but without any overarching government, the more appropriate term is warlords. And warlords tend to fight with one another. And even, I mean, the closest thing that you get to a system of cooperation among such warlords in modern civilized circumstances is the Mafia Commission of the mid-20th century. There's just enormous gains from
everybody wanted to have like larger, you know, organizations, right? Like corporations got bigger, the mafia got bigger, and everything. It's these interlocking directorates, right?
But clearly there are big gains if they can maintain peace. That's why the Mafia Commission got put together, in order to maintain peace. But it is punctuated by frequent wars and assassinations. It is an unstable equilibrium. As power shifts, then you know, wars are the way in which new equilibria settle themselves. If you want to maintain peace over a long period, there has to be some central source of armed force, some single central source of armed force that is able to maintain that peace. And Rothbard did not see that. And more generally, the other roles of the state that he couldn't get his mind around. He had a lot of trouble with the phenomenon of pollution. He opposed all of the anti-pollution legislation of the early 1970s, but what he offered in its place was either private tort suits or private ownership. He was certainly right. If you know, I'm sitting in my office in here in Chicago, I'm looking out my window at Lake Michigan. If one person owned Lake Michigan, he could keep anyone from polluting Lake Michigan, because he could sue anyone who owned Lake Michigan. If someone owned the atmosphere of the Earth, then they could get an injunction against anyone who could emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But come on, no one can own this. And if you leave it to private tort suits, the amount of the suits is too small to be worth bringing the suit. That's why someone who's generally pessimistic about state power, like Richard Epstein, eventually became persuaded the only solution for problems like that is regulation.
Okay, I don't know if he's heard of Alex Jones, but that's not a small tort. It seems to be Tho, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, his entire perspective on what competing private defense agencies, I mean, it goes against empirical. His entire notion of police is stupid. Or the idea that, I mean, most communities do not have a single police force operating. Right? You've got different precincts. You've got sheriff's offices versus city police. You've got state patrol. Right? You already have overlapping police services in large percentage of the country as is. And it doesn't break out into, you know, usually gang warfare between the cops, right?
Yeah.
And it's you have defense agencies, you know, like none of this. He's acting like this stuff is fairy tale stuff, where really it's just his own inadequate understanding of the way these processes actually work right now in the real world.
Well, this reminds me of Michael Malice talking about this same situation, and he always talks about Lord of the Flies, that everyone assumes it's going to be that, rather than like Gilligan's Island, where you actually, you know, work things out and get your coconut cream pie. So it is an interesting. Were there any other topics that you wanted to hit? Because I know we've already kept you for long enough. There's just other things we didn't get to. Bailouts, paternalism, drug war, criminal justice. What was your takeaway? And are you going to read this book?
I'm not going to read it at all.
Okay.
You know, it was a guy. Yeah, I'm more likely to look at, you know, when he comments on some I understand where he's coming from, and I think he's more serious than a lot of intellectual commentators out there right now. So I'll keep in touch with that. And there's this very interesting genre right now of left PhDs taking shots at libertarians.
Yeah.
I think some of that is still sort of, people that got book deals like back in like 2014 when people thought Rand Paul was going to be a thing, and they're still just cashing on those contracts. And I think this guy's is probably more is probably less crazy than Nancy McLean or Quinn Slobodian, who wrote an interesting book on globalism. But again, the thing is, ultimately though, he does a great job, I think, of illustrating the criticisms of Hayek within libertarian circles, and threats to how his stuff can be used. I always find this interesting because people like reason. People like Nick Gillespie, actually, in particular, right? What have we heard for 6 years now is the dangers of a libertarian to alt-right pipeline, because Christopher Cantwell will invoke Hoppe on immigration views, and therefore that shows the insidious nature of Hoppe-style libertarians. What we never talk about is the Hayek to socialism pipeline, which ultimately, not that Koppelman here is a socialist himself per se. I doubt he views himself like that, but at the very least, he is an apologist for social democracy, and Bernie Sanders and AOC, who are self-proclaimed democratic socialists.
By the way, I think those are the only two politicians he brought up.
Yeah, so those are the representations of Hayekian libertarianism, not Reason's favorite Democrat, Jared Polis, out there. And so I think it's useful just demonstrating serious people trying to reckon with libertarian history, which I do very much enjoy, and I enjoy these inner battles. But I don't think that Murray Rothbard destroyed libertarianism, to go to Reason's very good clickbait title.
Yeah, it is. So and I encourage everyone to watch this and maybe put it on 1.5 so you kind of get through it. Bailouts, those are good. Obamacare. I mean, I'm going to go through and read some of his stuff because I want to really get into the Randy Barnett, his debate, because I don't think that. By the way, he talks about how Obamacare was this great thing. Later on, he talks about the drug war, how medical access to it is not there. It's just not there like we should be. Yet he references the Obamacare as a great thing for getting everyone medical access. So I have problems with just those things. But I think that's what happens when you are guided more along the lines of where you are politically, and now you want to fit everything into that. Any last words, though, or Andy?
No, this has been fun. Enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, and super glad to have you come along. Andy, anything? When are you moving to Tennessee?
I got my U-Haul booked for the 30th, and I should be there by the 3rd or 4th. I'm going to stop and see Nick and his wife and their new baby in Louisiana on my way up, and maybe stay for a day.
All right, well, good trip for you. Once again, Tho, big fan. Thanks for coming on. Everybody go check out all his stuff. We'll add it to the links here. Andy, have a good trip. And by the way, if you still want to contribute to Andy's GoFundMe, you can do so. I'll put it in the links here. Tho, hang on. Like I say, we have an unnecessarily long outro. And then thanks, everybody. Sub to our channel and share it around. Thanks.
Okay, I'm leaving now. Bye, guys.
But she's back.
And now.
Chick-fil-A is completely overrated. It's not that good. I prefer Zaxby's. I prefer Popeyes.
Takes a tough man to make a tender forecast, Nick. And I guess that's me. Keep fucking that chicken.
Should I vote for Dick Cheney on the Libertarian Party? Do I have an obligation to vote for Dick Cheney?
I would say so.
Yes.
Did it work for those people?
No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
That one dude was like, not a podcast. I can't find it anywhere. They don't have video.
Oh, yeah, Peter Janke. Yeah.
Yeah, I blocked him.
I'll do it. If he unblocks me, I'll...
He'll buy your shirt if you unblock him, Bert.
He's a wigger.
Yeah, nothing cooler than a 49-year-old wigger. I just started live streaming. Cut me some slack. I'm pretty high tech for a boomer. But anyways,
boomer.